There are lives that begin in obscurity and climb toward power, and there are lives that are quietly arranged around power long before anyone notices, so close to the center that they are never meant to stand inside it. Camilla, queen consort, was not born into the throne, nor entirely outside of it. She entered the world within a social architecture that orbited royalty, an old network of land, titles, expectations, and carefully preserved distance. Close enough to understand the rules. Far enough to never belong. And yet, long before her name became inseparable from King Charles III, before the hostility, before the slow reconstruction of her image, there existed a quieter inevitability, something less visible than scandal, but far more decisive. Because the tragedy was never simply that she would be judged. It was that she was shaped within a system that required invisibility, and would later demand that she survive visibility at its most unforgiving. The question is not how she endured the scrutiny. It is why a life positioned so carefully on the edge of power would one day be pulled into its center, without ever being built to withstand it. Before she was ever seen, she belonged to a world that had already perfected the art of not being seen too clearly. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born into a class that did not need crowns to enforce its authority. The British upper class, landed, networked, and socially encoded, operated with a quieter permanence than monarchy itself. Titles could shift, public favor could fracture, but this world endured through continuity, the same families, the same rituals, the same unspoken agreements about who belonged and who did not. Her father, Bruce Shand, carried the residue of war and the expectations of masculine restraint. Decorated, disciplined, and shaped by a generation that did not speak of damage, he embodied a version of stability that left little room for emotional articulation. Survival, in his world, was proven through composure. Feeling was something to be managed privately, if at all. Her mother, Rosalind Cubitt, came from an even more embedded lineage, daughter of a baron, raised within a system where status was inherited but behavior was monitored. Her life, like many women of her class, was constructed around presentation, how to host, how to maintain, how to preserve the family's position without ever appearing to struggle for it. Together, they did not create instability in the obvious sense. There were no public scandals, no visible fractures that would mark the household as broken. But the absence of visible damage is not the same as the presence of emotional safety. What defined this environment was not chaos, but control. And control, when sustained over generations, produces its own form of silence. Camilla's early world was structured around a specific kind of invisibility, the expectation that one would exist comfortably within privilege without ever drawing excessive attention to oneself. To belong was to blend. To be accepted was to avoid disruption. Individuality was permitted, but only within the narrow boundaries of social acceptability. This was not a family that prepared its children for public scrutiny. It prepared them for continuity. There is a difference. Continuity requires adaptation to an existing structure. Scrutiny requires the construction of a self that can withstand external pressure. One demands compliance. The other demands resilience. Camilla was shaped for the first. The British upper class, particularly in the mid-20th century, operated on a paradox that was rarely acknowledged. It granted its members immense social freedom within a rigid psychological framework. Affairs were tolerated, emotional distance was normalized, and marriages were often less about intimacy than about alignment, of families, of expectations, of reputations. Within this system, contradiction was not a flaw. It was a feature. Men could be publicly respectable and privately detached. Women could be socially charming and emotionally constrained. The appearance of ease masked a deeper, more enduring discipline, the constant management of perception. Children raised in this environment did not need to be explicitly taught these rules. They absorbed them through observation, through tone, through what was not said. Camilla grew up watching a world where relationships were often negotiated rather than deeply felt, where affection existed but was rarely articulated with vulnerability, and where stability was measured not by emotional closeness but by the absence of disruption. This is not to suggest neglect in the conventional sense. She was not abandoned, nor deprived of care. But care, in this context, was structured, filtered through propriety, shaped by expectations that predated her birth. There is a particular kind of distance that emerges in such households. Not coldness, exactly, but a form of emotional containment. Feelings are present, but they are managed. Expressed carefully. Never allowed to destabilize the broader structure. For a child, this creates a subtle but lasting condition, the understanding that one's inner life must be calibrated against external expectations. You do not simply feel. You regulate. You do not simply express. You assess. And over time, the distinction between authentic emotion and socially acceptable reaction begins to blur. Camilla's education reinforced this architecture. She attended institutions that were less concerned with intellectual distinction than with social formation, schools where girls were prepared not for independence, but for integration into the same world their mothers inhabited. They were taught how to move through society, not how to question it. Charm, discretion, and adaptability were valued more than introspection. The goal was not to develop a distinct identity, but to refine one that could exist comfortably within existing hierarchies. This kind of upbringing produces individuals who are highly attuned to others, sensitive to shifts in tone, expectation, and approval. It fosters a social intelligence that allows for ease in complex environments. But it can also create a dependency on those environments for validation. When one's sense of self is formed in relation to a system, rather than independently of it, stepping outside that system becomes psychologically destabilizing. Not because the individual lacks strength, but because the framework that supports their identity no longer applies. Camilla did not grow up being encouraged to define herself against the world. She was shaped to move within it seamlessly. This distinction would become critical later, when the world she had been trained to navigate quietly would turn its full attention toward her. But before that attention came, there was another system, larger, more rigid, and far less forgiving, that had already been in motion. The British monarchy, particularly under Queen Elizabeth II, operated under a different but equally constraining logic. If the upper class valued discretion, the monarchy required symbolism. If Camilla's world emphasized blending in, the royal family depended on standing apart, on embodying continuity in a way that was visible, ceremonial, and relentlessly scrutinized. At the center of that system was an expectation that had defined generations: duty before self. And within that expectation, emotional reality was often secondary to institutional necessity. The monarchy did not simply shape behavior. It shaped relationships. Marriages were rarely private decisions. They were strategic alignments, evaluated not only for compatibility but for stability, optics, and long-term implications for the institution. Love, when it existed, was often required to coexist with constraints that would be unrecognizable in ordinary life. By the time Camilla entered adulthood, these two worlds, the aristocratic network she was born into and the royal institution that existed alongside it, were already intersecting in complex ways. They shared values, discretion, continuity, the preservation of image. But they differed in visibility. One operated quietly, behind the scenes. The other functioned as a public symbol, constantly exposed to scrutiny. Camilla belonged to the first. And yet, The conditions of her upbringing, her adaptability, her comfort within hierarchical structures, her understanding of unspoken rules, made her uniquely compatible with the second. Not as a public figure, but as a presence within it. This is where the contradiction begins to take shape. She was raised in a system that rewarded invisibility, that taught her to exist within power without claiming it, to navigate relationships without destabilizing them. And yet, the very qualities that allowed her to function so effectively in that environment would later draw her into a space where invisibility was no longer possible. The system she was prepared for required discretion. The system she would enter demanded exposure. Between these two realities lies the origin of her psychological tension, not a single event, not a moment of rupture, but a gradual misalignment between what she had been shaped to be and what she would eventually be required to endure. Because long before the world would define her as controversial, divisive, or resilient, there was already a quieter truth embedded in her formation. She had been taught how to exist beside power. Not inside it. And certainly not under its full, unforgiving gaze. Childhood, in certain families, is not a beginning. It is an early rehearsal. For Camilla, there was no singular moment when expectation arrived, no clear instruction that defined who she needed to become. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of cues, tones, reactions, silences, that shaped her long before she had the language to understand them. In households like hers, pressure does not announce itself. It is absorbed. She grew up in an environment where emotional expression was permitted, but only within limits that did not disrupt the social equilibrium. Laughter was acceptable. Charm was encouraged. But vulnerability, the kind that unsettles, that demands attention, that risks altering the structure, was quietly discouraged. This created a subtle but enduring condition, the need to anticipate the emotional climate of others before acknowledging one's own. Her father, Bruce Shand, represented a model of masculinity shaped by war and restraint. He was present, but his presence was defined by composure rather than emotional accessibility. The legacy of his generation was not overt severity, but a kind of disciplined distance, an understanding that stability required the management, if not the suppression, of internal complexity. For a child, this does not register as absence in the traditional sense. It registers as a boundary. You learn, gradually, where not to go. You learn which questions do not receive answers, which emotions do not invite engagement. And in that learning, you begin to edit yourself, not out of fear, but out of adaptation. Her mother, Rosalind Cubitt, embodied a different kind of control. Where her father's restraint was rooted in silence, her mother's was expressed through form. Social performance, in her world, was not optional. It was a requirement. Hospitality, presentation, the careful maintenance of relationships, these were not superficial concerns, but mechanisms of stability. Through them, the family's position was preserved, its identity reinforced. But performance, when sustained without interruption, leaves little room for deviation. A child raised within this framework learns that identity is not something discovered, but something managed. One does not ask, "Who am I?" One asks, "How am I perceived?" Camilla's early years were marked by this constant calibration. She developed an ease in social settings, an ability to navigate conversations, to read atmospheres, to adjust her presence according to context. These are often seen as strengths. And they are. But they come at a cost. Because when a child becomes highly attuned to external expectations, their internal world can become secondary, less defined, less protected, more susceptible to being shaped by others. This is where the first fractures begin, though they are rarely visible. Not in rebellion, not in distress, but in a quiet dependency on external validation. A reliance on being accepted, understood, or affirmed by the environment rather than from within. Camilla was not raised to resist her surroundings. She was raised to move through them fluidly. Her education reinforced this pattern. Schools like Queen's Gate School and later Institut Britannique were not designed to cultivate independence in the modern sense. They refined social competence. They prepared young women to occupy roles within a specific hierarchy. Confidence, in this context, was not about self-definition. It was about social ease. And social ease, when it becomes central to one's identity, can mask a deeper uncertainty, a lack of fixed internal grounding. Camilla learned how to be liked. She learned how to adapt, how to charm, how to exist comfortably within shifting dynamics. But she was not taught how to withstand rejection on a scale that could not be negotiated through proximity or familiarity. Because in her world, rejection was rarely absolute. It was managed, softened, contained within networks that provided continuity even in conflict. The idea of being exposed to a broader, more impersonal form of judgment, one that could not be influenced, navigated, or softened, did not belong to her early reality. And yet, there were early indications of another pattern forming. Within the British upper class, relationships often operated under a different logic than those shaped by emotional exclusivity. Affairs were not uncommon. Marriages were not always defined by romantic fulfillment. Loyalty existed, but it was complex, layered, negotiated, sometimes contradictory. Camilla grew up observing this. She learned that attachment did not always align with structure. That intimacy could exist outside of formal arrangements. That emotional connections could be sustained quietly, even when they did not conform to expectations. This understanding would later become central to her life. But at this stage, it functioned as a form of normalization. There was no clear boundary between what was permissible and what was not, only an understanding that discretion determined acceptability. This is a crucial distinction. Because it does not prevent conflict. It delays its visibility. By the time Camilla reached early adulthood, she had internalized a set of principles that would shape her decisions in ways that felt natural, even inevitable. She understood how to maintain relationships within complex structures. She understood how to navigate contradiction without forcing resolution. She understood, perhaps most importantly, that emotional truth and public reality were not always aligned, and that survival often depended on managing the gap between them. These are not inherently destructive traits. In many contexts, they are adaptive. But they become fragile when placed under conditions that do not allow for ambiguity. The world Camilla was raised in tolerated complexity. The world she would enter would demand clarity. It would require narratives, clear roles, defined boundaries, identifiable figures of sympathy and blame. There would be no space for the kind of quiet contradictions she had learned to live within. And when that shift occurred, the skills that had once protected her would begin to fail. Because adaptation, when stretched beyond its limits, becomes instability. And a self that has been shaped primarily in response to external expectations can struggle to withstand a moment when those expectations turn hostile. By the time she met King Charles III, then still a young prince navigating his own constraints, Camilla was not entering a new world entirely unprepared. She understood its language. She recognized its structures. But understanding a system is not the same as being able to survive its full weight. And in that distinction, between familiarity and resilience, the conditions for everything that followed were already in place. Because the question was never whether she could enter that world. It was whether she had ever been given the tools to endure what that world would eventually demand of her. There is a particular kind of relationship that feels stable not because it is simple, but because it fits too perfectly into the fractures both people already carry. When Camilla and King Charles III first became close in the early 1970s, it did not appear, on the surface, to be an act of defiance. It was not framed as disruption. It did not announce itself as something that would later destabilize an entire institution. It felt, instead, like recognition. He, shaped by a monarchy that had trained him for duty long before emotional autonomy, carried his own internal divisions. Raised under the unyielding expectations of Queen Elizabeth II and the distant, often austere presence of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Charles had been conditioned in a way that mirrored, but intensified, Camilla's own upbringing. Emotion was not absent in his world. But it was secondary. Filtered through obligation, measured against consequence, and often subordinated to the needs of the institution. In Camilla, he encountered something different, not freedom, exactly, but familiarity without performance. A space where he was not required to embody the future of the monarchy, where conversation could exist without calculation. For Camilla, the connection operated along a similar axis. Charles represented not only proximity to power, but an emotional alignment that fit seamlessly into her existing framework of relationships, complex, layered, not easily defined by conventional structures. This is where the illusion begins. Because relationships formed under conditions of mutual incompleteness can feel stabilizing, even when they are structurally unsustainable. They offer relief from external pressures, a sense of authenticity within environments that often demand performance. But they do not exist in isolation. And in this case, they existed within a system that could not accommodate them. The monarchy required clarity. It required a future queen who could be presented without ambiguity, whose role would reinforce, rather than complicate, the institution's image. Camilla, with her social background, her history, and the informal nature of her relationship with Charles, did not fit this requirement. Not because she lacked compatibility with him, but because she did not align with the narrative the monarchy needed to project. This distinction is critical. The decision that followed was not framed as rejection in emotional terms. It was framed as necessity. And necessity, within royal structures, carries a weight that personal desire cannot easily counter. Charles moved toward a different path, one that would lead to Diana, Princess of Wales, a young woman whose public image could be shaped into something the institution could present as ideal. The contrast between Diana and Camilla was not incidental. It was structural. Diana represented clarity, youth, beauty, emotional visibility, a narrative that could be easily understood and embraced by the public. Camilla represented complexity, experience, contradiction, a history that did not fit neatly into a singular role. The institution chose clarity. But personal alignment does not dissolve simply because it is inconvenient. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973, entering into a relationship that, by the standards of her social world, was functional, even expected. It aligned with her upbringing, with the norms she had observed throughout her life. Marriage, in this context, was not necessarily the culmination of emotional exclusivity. It was part of a broader system of continuity. And yet, the connection with Charles did not disappear. It adapted. Maintained quietly, existing within the margins, sustained by the very skills Camilla had developed since childhood, the ability to navigate complexity, to hold contradiction without forcing resolution, to exist within structures without fully disrupting them. For a time, this worked. Because the system, while rigid in its public expectations, allowed for a certain level of private ambiguity, as long as it remained contained. But containment is not permanent. Especially not when the individuals involved occupy positions of increasing visibility. As Charles's marriage to Diana progressed, the gap between public narrative and private reality began to widen. The world saw a fairy tale. Behind that image, there were fractures, misalignments, emotional distances, incompatibilities that could not be resolved through performance alone. Within that widening gap, Camilla's presence became more significant. Not as an intruder, in the way the public would later frame her, but as a continuation of something that had never fully ended. This is where the illusion of control begins to erode. Because what had once been manageable, existing within the margins, maintaining discretion, balancing multiple realities, was now intersecting with a level of visibility that could not be contained. The media, the public, the institution itself, all required coherence. They required a narrative that could be understood. And complexity, by its nature, resists simplification. Camilla, who had been shaped to operate within ambiguity, now found herself in a position where ambiguity was no longer tolerated. She was not equipped, psychologically or structurally, to become a public figure. She had not been raised for scrutiny. She had been raised for proximity. There is a difference. Proximity allows for influence without exposure. It allows one to exist within powerful systems without becoming the focus of them. But once that boundary is crossed, the dynamics shift entirely. Exposure demands definition. It demands that individuals be categorized, understood, assigned roles within a broader narrative. And in the emerging story of Charles and Diana, there was little room for nuance. There was the prince. There was the princess. And eventually, there would be a third presence, one that would be defined not by her own identity, but by her position within that narrative. Camilla did not construct this role. But she could not avoid it. Because the very qualities that had allowed her to maintain balance within private complexity, discretion, adaptability, emotional flexibility, offered little protection in a public environment that required fixed meanings. The relationship that had once felt like a space of control, of mutual understanding outside institutional constraints, was now becoming the source of instability. Not because it had changed, but because the context around it had. And in that shift, the question was no longer whether Camilla could navigate the structures she had always known. It was whether those structures, now exposed and redefined by public scrutiny, could still sustain her. Or whether they would begin, slowly and without ceremony, to close in. There is rarely a single moment where a life could have been redirected. More often, there is a period, brief, almost indistinct, when the conditions for departure exist, but the internal architecture required to act on them does not. For Camilla, that moment did not arrive with clarity. It emerged gradually, in the early 1990s, as the distance between public narrative and private reality became too wide to sustain without fracture. By then, the marriage between King Charles III and Diana, Princess of Wales, had already begun to deteriorate in ways that could no longer be concealed through ceremony or controlled appearances. The tension was no longer contained within private spaces. It was beginning to surface, through interviews, through subtle shifts in behavior, through a growing sense that something fundamental had broken beneath the surface of the royal image. This was the moment where withdrawal, at least in theory, was still possible. Camilla was not yet the central figure in a global narrative. She remained, to the broader public, peripheral, known within certain circles, but not yet defined by a singular role. The structures that had sustained her life until then, discretion, distance, the ability to exist within ambiguity, had not fully collapsed. There was still a version of events in which she could have receded. Returned to the private world she understood. Reinforced the boundaries that had once kept her protected. allowed the royal narrative to stabilize without her visible presence within it. But this assumes that departure is a purely rational decision. It is not. Leaving requires more than opportunity. It requires a self that exists independently of the system one is leaving. And this is where the earlier conditions of her life become decisive. Camilla had not been shaped to define herself outside of relational structures. Her identity had been formed within networks, family, class, social expectations, and most significantly, within the emotional dynamic she shared with Charles. That dynamic was not incidental. It had developed over years, reinforced through continuity, through shared understanding, through the kind of emotional alignment that is not easily replaced or restructured. To leave would not have been a simple act of separation. It would have required the dismantling of a psychological framework that had become integral to her sense of stability. And stability, once internalized through another person, is not easily relinquished, even when the external consequences become increasingly severe. At the same time, the system around her was beginning to shift in ways that made neutrality impossible. The publication of Andrew Morton's book in 1992, with its revelations about Diana's emotional distress, reframed the narrative entirely. What had once been perceived as a private marital difficulty was now positioned as a broader institutional failure. The public, presented with a more intimate view of Diana's suffering, began to reorient its sympathies. And in doing so, it required a counterpoint. Narratives, particularly those consumed on a global scale, tend toward simplification. They seek clarity, alignment, identifiable roles. Within this emerging structure, Diana became the embodiment of vulnerability, of emotional transparency, of a figure constrained by an unfeeling system. And within that same structure, there was an implicit need for an opposing figure. Not necessarily through explicit accusation, but through contrast. Camilla began to occupy that space. Not because she actively sought it, but because the narrative required it. This is the point where the missed exit begins to close. Because once a narrative assigns a role, stepping outside of it becomes exponentially more difficult. Every action is interpreted through that lens. Every silence becomes meaningful. Every attempt at distance is read not as withdrawal, but as confirmation. In 1993, the publication of the private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, what would become known as the Camillagate scandal, removed any remaining ambiguity. The private became public. The margins collapsed. And with that collapse, the possibility of retreat diminished almost entirely. This was not simply exposure. It was redefinition. Camilla was no longer a private individual connected to a public figure. She had become a public figure defined by that connection. And crucially, defined not on her own terms, but through a narrative that positioned her in opposition to someone who had already secured public empathy. At this stage, leaving would not have restored her previous life. Because that life no longer existed in the same form. The networks that had once provided insulation were now permeated by external perception. Her identity, once fluid within private contexts, had been fixed within a public framework. To step away would not have been a return. It would have been a displacement, into a space where neither the old structures nor the new narrative could fully accommodate her. This is the paradox of the missed exit. It appears, from the outside, as a moment of choice. From the inside, it is experienced as the absence of viable alternatives. Because every available path leads to a form of loss. To stay is to endure increasing scrutiny, hostility, and the gradual erosion of privacy. To leave is to dismantle the relational and psychological foundations that have sustained one's identity. Neither option offers resolution. Only different configurations of instability. Camilla remained. Not necessarily as an act of defiance, but as a continuation of the patterns that had shaped her from the beginning: adaptation, endurance, the maintenance of connection within complex and often contradictory circumstances. The system, meanwhile, continued to evolve. The separation of Charles and Diana in 1992, followed by their divorce in 1996, marked a formal acknowledgement of what had long been apparent. But formal acknowledgement does not resolve underlying tensions. It often amplifies them. Because it removes the structures that once contained conflict, exposing it more directly to public interpretation. Camilla, by this point, was no longer operating within the margins. She was within the frame. And within that frame, the narrative had already taken hold. The final closure of the missed exit came not through a decision, but through an event that would reshape everything that followed. The death of Diana, Princess of Wales in 1997 did not simply mark the end of a life. It marked the solidification of a narrative. Public grief, collective and immediate, transformed Diana into a figure of almost untouchable emotional significance. And within that transformation, all existing dynamics were reinterpreted. Camilla's position, already precarious, became even more fixed. Not through new actions, but through the weight of what had already been established. By the time the moment had fully passed, there was no longer an exit to miss. Only a reality to endure. Because the question was never simply why she did not leave. It was whether she had ever been in a position, psychologically, to do so. And by the time that question became visible, the conditions that made it relevant had already closed around her. Collapse, in certain lives, does not arrive as a visible breaking point. It does not announce itself through spectacle, nor does it offer the clarity of a single defining moment. Instead, it unfolds quietly, through contraction, through absence, through the gradual narrowing of a life once lived within broader, more fluid boundaries. For Camilla, the years following 1997 were not marked by dramatic downfall, but by a sustained condition of exposure without participation. After the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, public emotion did not dissipate. It intensified, consolidating into a narrative that left little room for reinterpretation. Grief, particularly on a collective scale, tends to simplify. It seeks coherence, alignment, a moral structure that can contain the magnitude of loss. Within that structure, Diana's image became fixed, an embodiment of vulnerability, of perceived injustice, of emotional authenticity constrained by an institution that could not accommodate it. And within that same structure, Camilla's position became equally fixed. Not actively condemned in every instance, but persistently defined through contrast. This is the form collapse takes when it is not allowed to be visible. It is not the destruction of external stability. It is the internalization of a role that cannot be escaped. Camilla withdrew. Not entirely, and not permanently, but in a way that reduced her presence to something minimal, controlled, and carefully mediated. Public appearances were limited. Visibility was not embraced, but managed, introduced gradually, strategically, with an awareness that any misalignment with public sentiment could reinforce existing perceptions. This was not rehabilitation in the conventional sense. It was containment. A recalibration of presence designed not to transform the narrative immediately, but to avoid intensifying it further. At the same time, her relationship with King Charles III continued, not in secrecy, but in a form that required patience, restraint, and an ongoing negotiation with the institution that had once excluded her. The monarchy itself, still operating under the long reign of Queen Elizabeth II, did not shift abruptly. It adapted slowly, cautiously, balancing internal realities with external perception. Camilla's reintroduction into public life was not a personal process. It was institutional. Each appearance, each acknowledgement, each incremental change in how she was positioned reflected not only her own endurance, but the monarchy's gradual recalibration of what could be accepted. But acceptance, in this context, did not equate to resolution. Because the narrative that had been constructed in the 1990s did not disappear. It remained, embedded in public memory, resurfacing periodically, shaping perception even as official positions evolved. Camilla existed within this duality. On one level, she became increasingly integrated into the royal structure, appearing alongside Charles, participating in official engagements, assuming roles that aligned with the expectations of someone moving closer to the center of the institution. On another level, she remained a figure defined by history. Not entirely rejected, but never entirely free from the context that had first made her visible. This creates a particular kind of psychological condition, one in which forward movement is possible, but never fully detached from the past. Progress exists, but it is layered over unresolved perception. The marriage between Camilla and Charles in 2005 marked a formal transition, an acknowledgement that what had once existed within ambiguity was now to be recognized openly. Yet even this moment, significant in structural terms, was carefully framed. She did not become Princess of Wales, a title still too closely associated with Diana. Instead, she assumed a different designation, one that allowed for inclusion without direct overlap with the past. This was not simply a matter of protocol. It was an indication of the limits within which her acceptance could operate. She could move forward, but not without constraint. Over time, her public image softened. Not dramatically, not through a single transformative event, but through accumulation, years of consistent presence, of controlled engagement, of a demeanor that aligned with the monarchy's emphasis on duty and continuity. The hostility that had once defined public reaction diminished. Not entirely, but enough to allow for a different kind of perception to emerge. Less intense. Less immediate. More distant. This is often interpreted as redemption. But redemption implies resolution, a clear transition from one state to another. What occurred in Camilla's case was more complex. It was adaptation. A gradual alignment between her role and the institution's evolving narrative, facilitated not by the erasure of the past, but by its integration into a broader, more stable framework. When Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022, and Charles ascended the throne, Camilla became Queen Consort. A title that, decades earlier, would have been inconceivable within the existing structure of public perception. And yet, by that point, the transition did not produce the same level of disruption that her earlier visibility had. Not because the past had been forgotten, but because it had been absorbed. Recontextualized within a longer narrative that emphasized continuity over rupture. From the outside, this appears as a form of resolution. A life that moved from marginalization to centrality. From controversy to acceptance. But this framing overlooks the nature of the process itself. Because at no point did Camilla fully step outside the conditions that had shaped her. She adapted to them. She endured them. She remained within a system that had first excluded, then gradually incorporated her, on terms that were never entirely her own. The collapse, then, is not found in a visible downfall. It is found in the absence of an alternative. In the narrowing of possibility until endurance becomes the only viable path. In the transformation of identity from something fluid and context-dependent into something fixed by narrative, by history, by association. Camilla did not disappear. She did not break publicly. she continued. And in that continuation, steady, controlled, externally composed, there exists a quieter form of collapse. One that does not end a life, but reshapes it entirely. Because the question is not how she survived the decades that followed. It is what, within that survival, was gradually relinquished in order to make it possible. In the end, there is no single version of Camilla that fully replaces the others. Not the woman who moved easily within the quiet codes of the British upper class. Not the figure cast into a narrative she did not author. Not the consort who now stands, formally, at the center of an that once had no place for her. All of them remain, layered rather than resolved. History, when it softens, does not erase. It redistributes weight. What was once immediate becomes distant, what was once intolerable becomes explainable. But explanation is not the same as release. Camilla's life, viewed from a distance, can be arranged into a sequence that resembles endurance rewarded, years of discretion, followed by gradual acceptance, culminating in recognition. But this sequence depends on a particular kind of simplification. It assumes that movement toward visibility is a form of arrival. It overlooks the cost of that movement. Because what defined her life was never simply proximity to power, nor even the controversy that later surrounded it. It was the quiet conditioning that preceded both, the formation of a self designed to adapt, to accommodate, to remain within structures rather than apart from them. A self that could survive, but not easily separate. And so the final image is not one of resolution, but of continuity. A figure who has reached the center of the system, but only by moving through it in the way she was always shaped to do, without rupture, without open defiance, without ever fully stepping outside its terms. There is stability now. There is recognition. There is, perhaps, a version of acceptance. But beneath that surface, the original contradiction remains intact. A life trained for invisibility, lived in permanent visibility. And no clear point at which it could have been otherwise.